Hi, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Karen Evans, and I am the chair of the board of the Advocates for Human Rights. Welcome to our celebration of International Women's Day. It's wonderful to be with all of you virtually. Before we get into the program, I have a few housekeeping items for you. We are recording this event, so if you prefer not to be shown, you may turn off your camera. But if you're comfortable keeping your camera on, it's great to see your faces. We have everyone muted to minimize background noise, so please chat to introduce yourself and say hi. The chat function is at the bottom of the screen. There is also a CC button down there in case you want to turn on automatic closed captioning. And last but not least, there is a reactions button which you can use to applaud, show agreement, or raise your hand. Now I would like to thank the host committee for their engagement in tonight's event. Many of you heard about this event when a member of our host committee reached out to you. Raise your hand, please, in the reactions panel or wave if this is your first event with the Advocates. You will hear tonight about some of the ways that the Advocates is working to protect women's rights. You can all be a part of that work tonight. Simply text the word women's, WOMENS, to 44321 to donate, or click on the link in chat. We have a goal to raise $40,000 to advance women's rights. We've already raised nearly $18,000 toward that goal. And thanks to the generous individuals who are matching donations, your gift will go twice as far. Thank you for participating with us in this absolutely critical work. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening, Filiberto Nolasco Gomez. Filiberto is a labor organizer, an investigative journalist and editor, and a new board member of the Advocates for Human Rights. Welcome, Filiberto.
Hey, thank you, Karen. And good evening, everyone. My name is Filiberto, as Karen mentioned, or you can call me Phil if we happen to run into each other outside of the digital realm. Like Karen mentioned, I've been a recent board member, but I've been around advocates for a long time, doing a lot of advocacy around women's rights, primarily through being an expert witness, focusing on Guatemala. Along with that, earlier this year, as we were planning and thinking about our arc of work for the year, there was a landmark court decision in Guatemala where 5 paramilitaries were prosecuted for the rape of indigenous women during the Civil War. Now, this justice comes 40 years after the actual events, and so it certainly speaks to the limitations and the opportunities to further advocacy around the rights of women around the world. And so that's what we're going to focus on tonight. That's what the panel is going to focus on, both the things that we're doing. Let me take a step back. One of the things that I've found out as a board member is while I've been around advocates for years doing human rights work and expert witness work, even for me, the scope of work that advocates does is dense and complicated and wide. And so really what we want to do in this panel is both speak to the work that advocates does on behalf of women throughout the world, but also think about the opportunities and the steps forward as we continue to see devastation around the planet. Advocates for Human Rights is one of the only human rights organizations that fuse their expertise serving individual women seeking safety, working within countries' civil society groups to change laws, systems, and advocating at the international scale at the United Nations to put pressure on governments to implement international human rights standards. So we work all the way from the ground up to the UN. And I think you're going to see and experience the full scope of what that means and the insight that it gives us. Tonight, we will highlight the complementary roles of different human rights mechanisms that can be utilized, how one woman obtains safety, how the government of one country can be held accountable, and how women's rights defenders can change the world for good. All right, so I'm going to introduce Sarah Brenes. She's the director of Refugee and Immigrants' Rights Program, and we'll talk about how the Advocates works with individual women fleeing gender-based violence and seeking asylum in the United States. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Filiberto. So representation of individuals seeking asylum is one of the core aspects of the work at the Advocates for Human Rights. It's one of our first programs that we established when the Advocates was founded. As lawyers, we've acquired special skills that allow us to navigate the complex labyrinth of rules that may lead clients to humanitarian protection here in the United States through asylum and other similar humanitarian relief. we're just one tool in the toolbox that clients tap into on their journey to safety. And for clients who've survived gender-based violence, this could be no truer. I'm going to give just a couple examples of a few women we've had the privilege of working with that really have exemplified this. One client, Ms. B, contacted our office several years ago asking for representation in her asylum claim. At the age of 15, she found herself in a relationship with a much older man. And for decades, she managed to survive the abuse by her partner while she was living in Central America. His blows sent her to the hospital multiple times, and in one instance resulted in a miscarriage of her unborn child. She sought help from police there, but she was simply sent home, told that domestic violence is a family issue and not something the courts would take up. She bore the weight of the dehumanizing insults, the debilitating blows, and the manipulating persuasion because she saw no way out. And in fact, she had 3 children by this man and initially thought that she was being strong for her children by putting up with the abuse, keeping it a secret from her family. She eventually confided in a female friend at work who told her, "You've got to find a way to get out of this circle," and eventually made her way to the United States. Other women that she met in the US helped her find legal and psychological help to reestablish her confidence and her love for herself. I talked with her yesterday and asked her about where she found this strength in order to survive. She spent years separated from her children, and she named a number of different women that she encountered along the way that guided her to find strength to continue forward, to find patience, and really talked about really a long path that she took where she didn't trust anyone. And it's a bit ironic because last summer, and this was even before her case was ultimately granted, we were doing some outreach in greater Minnesota, and she lives in central Minnesota now. And we were going to visit her for a meeting related to her case to talk about her case and add some things for her affidavit. And she said, "Well, I've got a few friends here at my house." And in fact, her small home was filled with a number of families who had recently arrived from the border that were from the country where she was from, that was now experiencing significant political oppression to opposition groups. And she stood there in complete confidence with all of these folks and advocated for them and told them to trust themselves, trust what had happened to them, and trust us at the advocates and the volunteers that we work with to work on their cases. And it was a complete turnaround and really testament to her finding strength in herself, finding strength in the tools that she could rely on here, the mental health providers that assisted her, and us at the advocates and the volunteers that worked on her case. She came to us over 5 years ago, so it took a lot of patience and persistence to finally receive a grant of asylum and be able to be reunited with her children. Another example I'll give is really a bit of a transition to our next work. And one of the things that I have found a lot of pride in the work we do here at the Advocates and in connecting clients with our international advocacy. And this was a situation where we had gotten a referral from a legal clinic that was working in Texas, and they had met with a woman who had arrived at the US border and had a negative credible fear interview. It's a mini interview that individuals have at the border if they claim a fear of returning to their country. And she wasn't initially successful, but she was able to appeal the case to an immigration judge. She did so, got help from this legal clinic. And then the judge reversed that negative decision. So she was allowed to come into the United States and apply for the full protection of asylum. And so this clinic referred her case to us, and she came in and she brought all of her paperwork with her that she presented to the judge in order to get the chance to seek asylum. And among the papers were one of the reports that the advocates did to one of the human rights bodies at the United Nations. And so to see that come full circle and see that this individual that we are now going to represent our organization more broadly was able to use its international advocacy and really kind of coming full circle was exciting to see. Back to you, Filiberto.
Well, thank you, Sarah. I think you really evidence one of the challenging components of doing this work is that we always sit between despair and joy and sort of alternate between or feel both at the same time. And, it's heavy. It's heavy doing this work. Next up, sorry, one thing I want to mention is really appreciate everyone jumping in on the chats, shouting out where they're from. At the end, I'm going to compile some questions based on your comments. So certainly keep chatting away, ask questions, comments, whatever feels good to you. Use that space. Thank you. All right. Next up is Jennifer Prestholt. She's the director of our International Justice Program, and she'll now tell us how the Advocates works with partners in other countries to document the human rights violations experienced by individuals and bring their voices and recommendations for change to the attention of the international community through advocacy at the UN human rights through advocacy at the UN human rights mechanisms.
Exactly. Perfect.
Thanks.
So I'll take it from there and say thank you, Filiberto, and also thanks to Sarah. Sarah really illustrated so powerfully the importance of the work that we do to represent individuals and to provide safety to women like the clients that she described. I am going to take it out I don't know how many, a million miles and talk about how we change the human rights conditions that force our clients to flee and how things kind of come full circle. And that's through our international advocacy at the United Nations and also at the regional human rights mechanisms like the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. International advocacy is really a powerful tool. We use it to amplify the voices of our human rights partners in other countries, and also to give space to the voices of our clients to talk about their experiences. And bringing the facts about the human rights conditions and recommendations for changes that address those problems to the international community can really be a powerful tool to push governments to uphold their responsibilities to protect human rights. So you can kind of think about it as a pressure cooker where you've got the international community putting pressure from the top, and then our human rights defender partners putting pressure from the grassroots up. And it really results in change. So I'm going to give you just a couple of examples. The first is just a couple of examples of advocacy at the UN Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council is a political human rights body. Its major mechanism is something called the Universal Periodic Review Process, or UPR, which is, you can sort of imagine a peer review of 196 other countries in the world. So every 4.5 years or so, every single country that is a member of the United Nations has to report about their human rights record to other countries, and those other countries make recommendations to improve human rights. So our advocacy strategy is to encourage those Human Rights Council delegates to make our recommendations, and we really have seen an impact. For example, we regularly report on countries like Honduras and Ethiopia, countries where we have a lot of clients who have had to flee gender-based violence against women and girls. And to seek asylum here. So you've heard Sarah's stories about those clients. Imagine how we take those stories, used with consent, of course, but we take those stories of courageous clients and bring them up to the international community. And the impact is astounding, really. So in 2020, we participated in a report on Honduras, and 39 countries urged a stronger response to violence against women in Honduras, up from 15 the previous UPR cycle, about 5 years before. So that's a 160% increase in attention on the issue. Similarly, in Ethiopia, recommendations on violence against women to Ethiopia increased by 169.2%. Over the previous cycle, just 5 years before. And some countries really respond well to this kind of political pressure. So one example is after Croatia's UPR in 2015, the government was so embarrassed by the criticism and attention that the international community showered on them at this UPR process. They had decriminalized their domestic violence law, but they were so embarrassed by that attention that they quickly acted to make it a crime again. And then similarly in Tunisia, we did advocacy there as well around a law that allowed rapists to marry the minor victim of their rape, so they would avoid prosecution if they married their victim. And so that law has been abolished as well. But my second example is about advocacy at the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW. So when a country ratifies a human rights treaty, they are basically opting into being reviewed by independent experts at the UN for their compliance with that treaty. So it's different from that political peer pressure kind of process. So if you have ratified the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which the U.S. is one of the very few countries in the world that has not, then you are agreeing to report every 6 years or so to the committee. So I'm going to tell you the story of one country, and that country is Colombia. I'm going to give you a very brief overview of our advocacy and work to change laws to better protect women in Colombia. But we did do a full-hour continuing legal education event yesterday. So if you'd like to know more, we will put the link in the chat, and that video is on our YouTube channel, so you can go and hear from the experts on that. But Colombia, as many of you know, experienced a really brutal, decades-long conflict with multiple violent and criminal actors. And after the 2016 peace agreement, demilitarization of all of these different groups really resulted in violence being brought into the homes as combatants came back to their home. So intimate partner violence is a huge problem in Cambodia, with women experiencing really high rates of physical and psychological violence, and really, really horrible and multiple forms of violence. So into our partners, and I will just call them our International Women's Day Sheroes today, Dr. Greta Friedemann-Sanchez from the University of Minnesota Humphrey School, and Peggy Grieve, who is on our board and one of the host committee members. In 2015, Greta and Peggy went to Colombia and conducted extensive research throughout the country to document the problem of intimate partner violence and to really pinpoint the barriers to implementation of a law that was actually very good on the books, but the implementation was terrible. So, and massive problems with it. And one problem in particular was that the family commissioners, which were the local offices that were given the responsibility for issuing orders for protection, were so overburdened that, as one family commissioner was quoted in their book that they published, the responsibilities hang on family commissioners like they hang on a Christmas tree. So they had so many responsibilities that they couldn't do the actual work of issuing the civil orders for protection. So Peggy and Greta identified a number of other problems as well: lack of resources, a really bizarre mismatch of the number of family commissioner offices to the need, so like an inverse match to need and the availability of the offices. Mayors were given responsibility or authority to assign additional responsibilities, so they just kept piling them on in some regions. But the bottom line is that women and girls were not getting the protection that they desperately needed in Colombia. And it was an institutional structure that was just set up to fail women and girls. So it was our good luck that Colombia was due not only to report for the UPR in 2018, and we did advocacy there, but they also reported to CEDAW in 2019. So we took all of this research and recommendations for change, and we began our joint advocacy at the UN in Geneva. So we were there in February of 2019. And, we start with a written report. So Sarah referenced the report that she saw used as documentation in one of the asylum, or in several asylum cases. We've seen it now. So taking that human rights documentation and then developing one-pager advocacy materials, doing briefings with members of the committee, and really sitting down to explain the problems. The results were incredible. So CEDAW has a practice of they name priority recommendations. So the country has to come back within 2 years and say specifically what they're doing on those priority recommendations. And 2 of the 4 priority recommendations directly addressed our issues. So I've been doing UN advocacy for a long time. I've never seen that that level of success. Greta and Peggy continued their advocacy in Colombia. They published a book and they did a lot of regulatory analysis and met with people in different ministries in Colombia. But the legal amendment to this law that was good on the books but bad in implementation was submitted to Congress on July 20th, 2020. So only a year, almost a year and a half from when we did our advocacy. And Law 2126 was issued on August 4th, 2021, and it amended the original law to address a lot of these problems. So the timing is significant because it did allow Colombia to go back to the UN and say, oh, look, we did make these changes within 2 years. But the changes are, they removed the extra responsibilities that these family commissioners had, prohibited mayors from adding more. They increased the number of family commissioner offices to better reflect the need for services. And then some institutional changes were made, including moving the family commissioners' offices under the Ministry of Justice instead of under the local executive mayoral offices. So we still have a lot of work to do, but since this is International Women's Day, I just want to take a moment to savor this success, and I would love to have you join me in a round of applause for Greta and Peggy and all of the other people in Colombia who made this huge change possible. So here. And that's it from me.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that overview and reminding us that we do have to celebrate our victories. There often feels like they're few and far between, but when they happen, we got to hold on to it, Yeah. All right. Now up next is Rosalind Park, the director of the Women's Human Rights Program, to share what we are doing to support activists in Ukraine and empower our partners around the world. I am super excited to hear about this and also a little terrified of what you're going to share with us, Rosalind. So just be gentle. I just feel like I want to get my cat and cuddle with her for a second while I listen to you. But,
thanks, Billy. That's a good warning, note of caution. I appreciate it. And yes, buckle your seatbelts. We have a lot to cover.
There's some PowerPoints coming up. You got questions, pop them in the chat, and we'll be with you here.
So welcome, everybody. It's great to see you all. I'd like to begin by sharing a photo. This photo was taken in 2019 during my very last trip before the pandemic. I was training at our partner, the Feminist Intensive NGO, at their camp in the Carpathian Mountains in Ukraine. The partners traveled huge distances to get there. Some of them spent 17 hours on various trains just to arrive. And not all the trains in Ukraine were as comfortable as the TGV or the ICE. But these women, they are bright and they are committed to their causes. They are activists in their communities, and they wanted to become better women's rights defenders. They showed up every day, ready to learn, contribute to the discussions, and share their skills with one another. We spent an incredibly rewarding time together. So let me point out a few people to you. Helena and Marta is with our partner NGO Center Women's Perspectives. You can see them in the red circle right there. This is an NGO in Lviv that serves women victims of violence, and now they are serving internally displaced persons. Helena and Marta are 2 of my favorite people in the world. They are amazing, they are committed, and they are effective. Next, we have Yulia, who's also in the red circle. She is a young woman who was 16 during the 2014 invasion. And we also have Diana, who is an internally displaced person. So I want to talk a little bit more about Diana. Diana was one of the participants, the last one you just saw in that photo. Now, when I met her in the Carpathian Mountains, she told me that she was an internally displaced person from the 2014 invasion into Ukraine. She had not seen her parents for 5 years because she could not go back home. She had been on the front lines protesting the Russian invasion at that time. And because of that, she was forced to say goodbye to her home and her parents. She fled from Donetsk in order to stay alive. And she knew that she would be arrested and detained if she ever stepped foot in Donetsk again. So fast forward to 2022. Today, she finds herself once again under attack. She said goodbye to her new home and was sheltering in Mariupol for the time being. I heard from her on Friday, and she sent me a message that she was escaping from Mariupol, which has suffered heavy major attacks. So once again, she is escaping from violence and war. Diana and her husband made it out safely, but just barely, just right before you guys started seeing it all across the news with the failure to create humanitarian corridors to let people escape. I next want to talk about Alina. Alina also participated in the feminist intensive camp, and now she is sheltering with others in Kiev subway stations. She wants the world to know that she and many of her peers have taken up arms to defend their country now. This is a photo of Alina's home. This is her attempt to protect her family from the shrapnel. Alina participated in our legal training academy for Russian-speaking lawyers. And during this training, we taught the participants how to defend women's human rights at the highest levels in the world, just like Jennifer was talking about. For example, the European Court of Human Rights or the UN. We gave Alina the award for being the most punctual at our training. She was always on time, early in the morning, after coffee breaks, after lunch break. She was always there, the first one. When I spoke to her last week, she was exhausted and she was demoralized. She had been sheltering all night while 6 rockets rained down on their shelter. Right now, many of these activists are just trying to survive. It is terrifying. They are scared and they are brave, ready to defend their country, speak up for human rights, and document human rights violations. We are one world. And so when our partners are sheltering in basements and subway stations, fleeing to safety, or taking up arms to defend their country, we must stand together with them in solidarity. You may wonder what we at the Advocates are doing to support Ukraine. We are talking to women like the ones you just saw in these photos to get on the ground information about war crimes and crimes against humanity. We will be sending the information straight from Ukraine to the International Criminal Court, where a prosecutor has opened an investigation into Ukraine. We are giving voice to the people of Ukraine and making sure their experiences and stories reach the prosecutor so he can build the strongest case possible. This is an example of our work in one country, and we are working with partners in many countries and on a global scale. So many of you know that we released our Backlash to Human Rights report. We documented how the far right is trying to roll back human rights for all. We know that there is an internationally networked, highly organized, and well-funded movement designed to hurt people in the US and around the world. We interviewed activists to document the far right's movement to roll back human rights. One of their targets is protection against domestic abuse. For example, Belarus tried to adopt a new law on domestic violence, but its president vetoed the law in 2018, calling it Western rubbish. We have learned that this backlash, it's not an isolated incident, but it's part of a global and a sophisticated network of actors. We see their effects happening in other countries and right here in the US. They are interconnected. Remember 2012? The marriage amendment that would have defined marriage as between a man and a woman and banned same-sex marriage? This was not an isolated effort, nor unique to the US. We saw this exact same referendum play out in countries like Armenia, Croatia, and Romania. The far-right tactics that we saw then and continue to see here are being replicated around the world. There is one big difference. Countries like Armenia and Croatia don't have the same well-resourced response we had here in the US. You may recall the Love is Love campaign that changed hearts and minds across Minnesota and the US. Many groups worked together to develop and execute that campaign. And when we don't share our experiences and resources, places like Croatia lose, where same-sex marriage is now outlawed. This is just one example of the far right's tactic to harm a group of people. But the far right is doing much more to strike collectively at the rights of women, immigrants, and children on a global scale. And it's succeeding. It takes all of us to fight back. If we want to protect the human rights of vulnerable populations, including women, LGBTI persons, immigrants, and children that are under attack, we need to recognize, understand, and counter the far right's efforts to undermine human rights. We need to share successful strategies and work collaboratively across borders and around the world. So let me go back to some photos for a moment here, and I want to give you an example of how we are doing that. When I was in Ukraine at the Feminist Intensive Camp, I shared messaging strategies that we are using here in the US, and I think you all recognize this meaning. Now, as an expression of solidarity, I gave my pussy hat to our partner, Marta, in Ukraine. And since then, Marta has been wearing that pussy hat at every protest and march in the streets of Ukraine. This is how we support our partners. We share our strategies and sometimes our hats. Together, we learn what works to fight this war that we are all fighting, the war against the far right. We are leveraging volunteers and supporters like you to support human rights activists in countries around the world. I want to visit one last picture. Yulia. Yulia was 16 years old when Ukraine was invaded in 2014. She and her mom took trains to get to safety, and on Constitution Day, they arrived. And she remembers everything was covered with flags and people wore embroidered shirts, which is the traditional Ukrainian attire. I quickly put on my own and we went for a walk. I wanted to hug every flag. Before or after, I have never felt such love for state symbols. This is what we do. We give voice to people like Yulia and make sure their stories count. Make sure their stories create change, because in the end, we are one world. We are one people. We are the advocates for human rights. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a little round of applause on that. Thank you, Rosalind. I think certainly when I hear things like that, I just want to take a second and just take a deep breath and center myself back into where we are. So it's a lot of content. So I think we've pretty well demonstrated that at the Advocates, we work broadly and we work deeply with our partners all over the planet. And it takes a lot of dedication from the staff and also volunteers and folks like you that are just looking to learn and be more aware of what's going on in the world. It takes a lot of resources to do all that. It takes a lot of resources to help women tell their stories, to gain asylum, to protect women from violence, to advocate for better laws, and to hold perpetrators of human rights violations accountable, and to pressure governments to protect the human rights of all people. And there is one simple way, and this, what's one simple way to the first step to supporting us is to help with donations. We're looking to raise $40,000 to protect women's rights. All donations will be matched 100%. So simply text women's to 44321, and I'm hoping somebody puts that in the chat. Yes. And if you're already given, thank you so much. We were grateful for each and every one of you that came tonight. And it's up to all of us, really. We're part of a global community, and that also means that we're all responsible for being global advocates to advance human rights advocacy against human rights violations. So thank you again for all the fabulous speakers, Karen, Sarah, Jennifer, and Rose, and thanks to all participating. I saw two questions in the text, one from Isabel about any branches in medicine, and it looks like, Christina, you responded, we don't have a specific branch in medicine. So just a technical question, how can people just volunteer and support the work? What's the best way to reach out to advocates? Can anyone answer that, please?
I think we're all thinking the same thing. You can go to our website, and we have, and in the get involved section at the top, you can find out more information about how to be an intern, how to volunteer. If you are, we're always looking for volunteer attorneys to help us with representing asylum seekers if you're an attorney. So there's multiple ways to get involved. But we strongly believe that everyone has a part to play in the human rights movement, and so would really encourage you to get involved.
And just as an opening question for the panelists, I know you all are deeply devoted to what you do and have been doing it for a long time. And I think maybe some of the folks listening in are sort of wondering the same thing I'm wondering. How do you all just kind of take care of yourself? Like, what do you do to sort of contend with the emotional gravity of what you're working with and just come back to the work the next day? Like, what are some of the things that you all do to take care of yourselves?
Me, I think about those women in Ukraine. I've been thinking about them every day. And I think if they can live and survive what they're doing, surely we can carry on our work here and do that for them. So for me, it's the women and the partners overseas in other countries who sustain me.
Mm-hmm.
I want to echo that. I think we're so fortunate that we get to meet some of the most extraordinary people in the world, and they're so inspiring. And every day I appreciate that. And it's especially difficult to see our Ukrainian partners and friends having such difficulty, but they're also keeping their spirits up.
Jennifer, what do you do to just keep yourself in a good place and doing the work?
You know, like I just went for a run right before this, you know, like the get enough sleep, get exercise, eat well, like all that standard stuff. But then ultimately, I just feel like it's such a privilege to work with folks, including our clients. We've been doing a lot of work with, especially recently, we've been trying to do more work to encourage our clients who are human rights activists to be actively involved. And it's just such a privilege to walk beside them as they, you know, sort of they've crossed a border, but they're still human rights activists, even though they're refugees. And so to be able to be there with them and help them to get their message across and speak truth to power, it's just amazing to be part of that. So that's definitely a big thing that keeps me going. Plus I've been, you know, I'm getting old. So, you know, I've been doing this for so long that I actually see change. So having that big picture is also a really important piece of it.
Mm-hmm. Having that wide perspective, certainly.
Yeah, exactly. If you focus just on the day-to-day struggle, then it's harder to keep going.
You have any thoughts on that, Sarah?
Yeah, I'd agree with everyone else. I think, you know, I remember meeting with a few different clients who were separated from their children. And when they learned that I had kids, you know, their advice to me is like, go home and spend time with your kids, and really sincerely saying that. So I think, you know, having demands outside of work, I think really help keep the balance. And I think as well, you know, just realizing the role that we as lawyers, at least in asylum work, is really important for people to be able to establish their safety and long-term ability to remain in the United States. But we're just one piece of the puzzle, one tool in their toolbox. So I think really humbly understanding and helping people get connected to those other supports that are really integral to having holistic support and getting folks to the next chapter of their lives is, I think, really helps balance our work, understanding that we're part of this broader network of supporting women on their journeys.
No, I think you bring up a good point. Like the work that I've done in Guatemala, every once in a while when somebody stops me that I'm working with and they're like, hey, buddy, you got to take a break. You seem kind of stressed out. I'm like, oh, it's always humbling to have that sort of accountability too, to hold me accountable to taking care of myself. I think Anne had a question for Jennifer. Why has the U.S. not ratified the agreement that you mentioned?
Yeah, so this is the perennial question, what's wrong with the United States of America? And it's even worse with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We're the only country, now that Somalia has ratified it, we're the only country that hasn't ratified those treaties. So the short answer, there's a procedural reason in the way that treaties are ratified within the U.S. Congress. So so there's a number of treaties that are signed but haven't been pushed forward for ratification. But anyway, so it's very easy to stop it from moving up through the Foreign Service Committee. So that's one, and then the other is just the issues, the women and children. Those are the two. We've ratified the Convention Against Torture. Our asylum law is based on our obligations to implement the Refugee Convention. And we ratified the International Covenant on Political Rights. But just given the particular subjects of the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination against Women and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, there's strong political opposition to giving, the UN authority, which isn't actually what happens, but that. So that's the short answer. The one that's a real question is we have also not ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is based on the ADA. So, yeah, I'll stop there because I could go on for a lot longer.
Philly, I can add a couple of explanations on CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. That has not been ratified. And a few of the myths that are floating around, for example, people argue that they have defined discrimination so broadly against women that it's going to lead to frivolous lawsuits. Another argument is that it's going to destroy our traditional family structure by redefining the family and redistributing roles to men and women. There's myths that it will legalize the commercial sex trade and so on. So there's no end to the myths that are kind of bandied about in order to keep this treaty at bay and out of our reach.
Yeah, and I definitely want to reiterate that some of the language that you're describing, Rosalind, some of the responses, I'm certainly, if we're all paying attention, we've seen some of that same language used in the United States to combat advancements of rights for different sorts of communities all over the country. So it's just something to keep in mind that these are coming, while dispersed around the globe, these are coming from very narrow actors with lots of money and lots of motivation to pursue their interests. For folks that have been really engaged by the content, that are checking out the links, that are perhaps reading the report, what are some of the ways that folks can just keep up with all the different information that Advocates produces? I know there's a couple newsletters, a periodic podcast, but as we've talked about, Advocates does a lot, and they have a wealth of information. We have a wealth of information, and that comes out both through these events and also the newsletters. So where can folks sign up for the newsletters?
So that's also on our website. We do a monthly newswire. So would encourage people to start by signing up for that. And it looks like Liz just put the link in the chat. And you can also, of course, follow us on social media as well as get on our. If you donate, then you'll get on. You'll be able to get our Observer, our newsletter, which comes out in the fall. So lots of ways to find out what's going on. But I just want to emphasize how important it is that you're here tonight. You have many other options. And so the fact that you are engaged in a human rights discussion is just a really, really important step in making change in the world. So thank you for being here.
And just one final question, unless there's more coming through the chat. For the panelists, what are some of the things that you're looking forward to the next year in terms of advocacy, in terms of just something from your personal life, perhaps, but just to get a feel of what's on the horizon, I guess.
I can add just a few things where the immigration court has been closed for a few years now with COVID, and we're starting to see more cases be scheduled and heard before the immigration court in a number of cases involving gender-based violence, women who are domestic violence survivors, and perhaps a silver lining of the pandemic is before the pandemic, we had some really restrictive laws on asylum protection for domestic violence survivors that has changed. And so we're looking forward to the opportunity to advocate for asylum for our clients in those situations under hopefully more welcoming laws related to domestic violence survivors. So that's one thing that we're looking forward to the Refugee and Immigrant Program.
We're looking forward to seeing our partners again in person. I'm really hopeful we can get back to some normalcy where we can meet in person and train in person. For the past couple of years now, we've been training through our Women's Human Rights Training Institute, WRT, as it's called, lawyers across Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet states, how to defend women's rights at the highest levels in the world. And all of these trainings have been taking place, over Zoom for several days in a row. And what we know is these people also want to network with each other, especially in today's world. It's so important to build that community, that cohort of peers who can support and lean on each other. So we're really hopeful that this May we'll be able to convene in person in Bulgaria to do our final training with them on UN advocacy and protections.
Absolutely. Jennifer?
Yeah, no, it's same thing, being able to, get together in person again with our partners. We haven't been able to go to Geneva. We were scheduled to go in March of 2020 and had to pull the plug on that trip just 2 days, I think, before Amy and I were supposed to get on a plane. So I guess the silver lining of the pandemic is that the UN has greatly expanded the opportunities to participate remotely. That means I've had 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. briefings over the past week, so because of Geneva time, but it still is a really positive thing to be able to expand opportunities for civil society that can't travel to Geneva to be there. But there's nothing like being there in the room where it happens, and so we're looking forward to being able to do that again.
Great. And a couple questions coming in. Laura is wondering, there's been a perception or a belief that there's been increased domestic violence because of the pandemic. Is Advocates doing anything around that concern?
There has indeed. So that's a great question, Laura. Domestic and sexual violence has increased not only here in the US, but all around the world. One of the first things we did back in May 2020 was we convened a small group of volunteers to carry on fact-finding, do interviews with different people, police, judges, prosecutors, social workers, and NGOs to find out, okay, what's happening with violence against women cases? Where are the gaps now that we're all virtual? And they were turning around this information in real time. Every few interviews, we would send over a summary analysis to our local partners here in Minnesota who could use it for their advocacy. And I think one of the most powerful impacts we saw come out of that was, some of you remember that Governor Walz had issued a ban on evictions, and as part of the pandemic. Some judges were interpreting that ban on evictions as applying to an order for protection in domestic violence cases. So they're not ordering removal of the perpetrator from the home. So when we learned this, we got word over to the governor's office. And when you look at his subsequent eviction order, it actually includes a specific paragraph that says this order does not apply to orders for protection.
Wow, I didn't even know that. That's incredible.
Yeah, that was a really important piece of work that Rose and her team carried out. I would just emphasize that this is true worldwide, that the increase in intimate partner violence has been happening during the pandemic throughout the world. So we're working right now with partners in Morocco on including that in our report to the Human Rights Council.
And there's also a question for Mary around what's happening with Stop VAW. And Thekla sent a link there. Does anyone else want to respond to that?
Sure, I can pick that up. That's within the women's program work. Stopva.org. Please check it out if you're looking for any information on violence against women. It is a great resource. I use it all the time. We are continuing to update and make sure that information is regular. And stay tuned, because in our What's News section, we have been monitoring the news about the far right that I just described in my remarks tonight. So all of that hard work of monitoring and watching the news and articles, that's going to start rolling out on StopBob very soon. We're really excited about that. So I definitely encourage you to check out the website, StopBob.
Thank you. Is there any other questions? Any other thoughts? Great. So I want to just come back to, people always want to know with these kind of conversations, what can I do? So there's 3 things you can do tonight. There's the first thing you can do is donate. So that's, again, simply text women's to 44321. And then from there you get a link and, do your thing. Another way you can support is by volunteering, and the link is in the chat. And then also just keeping up to date, being aware, being conscientious, being informed, right? The more that we know what's going on, the more our friends know, our families know. Certainly these things circulate. And the more awareness that everyone has around the conditions around the globe of people in oppressed situations, the better off we are. And that certainly is part of the work too, just to raise that consciousness. Well, thanks for coming, everybody. Hope you, I don't want to say had a good time, but hope you enjoyed our time together. Yes. How's that? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.